quick draw would roll. The highfalutinist has the shootinest cowboy you ever saw. That quick draw would roll.
Hey, welcome in the audience watching on KPLR 11.2. Now you are watching a TV show of a radio show live on the Big 550 KTRS. Our thanks to Taliesin Technologies for all the help. STLtoday.com, KTRS.com, and of course 550 on your AM dial. Hey, it's Easter weekend. Happy Good Friday, and it's a chance to sort of take a moment and talk a little history with our next guest. He has edited this book that I have in my hand. His name is William Anderson. The book is called The Selected Letters of Laura Ingalls Wilder. William Anderson, welcome to Big 550 KTRS.
Thanks so much. Good to be here.
Your affinity for authors from Missouri is interesting. You did a lot of work. You wrote a book about Mark Twain, and now you've done quite a bit with Laura Ingalls Wilder.
I did. It's serendipitous. I taught Twain for years as a teacher,
right,
and then got to write about him, and I was introduced to Wilder back in third grade when we heard her books read aloud, as many millions of American kids.
Can you move the microphone a little closer to the mouth there? There you go. There you go. Good. Yeah. So you, as a kid, you fell in love with Laura Ingalls Wilder.
We were indoctrinated. We did all sorts of pioneer activities, and every day before lunch, we heard another chapter of the book, and I got very interested in history as a result and reading, and became a teacher and a historian. All my 26 books are nonfiction,
right,
usually American history.
Usually the true story is better than the fictionized account of the story. Many of us only know Laura Ingalls Wilder from the TV show Little House on the Prairie.
Truly.
But the real story is much more interesting.
It is, and it is true American history of the frontier era. And what Wilder did was recreate that era of homesteading, approximately 1870 to 1889. And the books are wonderful storytelling and accurate history of that era.
And so how does a woman on the frontier who, doesn't have a book club, she's out milking the cows, she's out using the plow, she's out building the homes, how did she have time to pen, paper, write it, and then save it for all these years?
Well, she had an incredible memory. And she didn't start writing her books until she was 65 in 1932 on Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri.
Wow. So she kept them all in her head and then wrote them all down.
She did, and she felt very much that her own life had been a quick transition from covered wagons and log cabins into modern life.
And so she thought, wow, the things I've seen in my lifetime.
That's what she said, and she felt a call to preserve that history for American kids.
The book is called The Selected Letters of Laura Ingalls Wilder. William Anderson, our guest. You were in town for a couple of book signings and a book reading. So you took her letters. Tell us about the book here.
I did. I have written quite a few books on the Wilder topic, including Laura Ingalls Wilder, a biography. So I studied her letters as just part of my research. Most of her papers are kept at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library, so I spent a lot of time there.
That's in Ohio?
It's in Iowa, West Branch, Iowa. So in the back of my mind, I thought every famous person eventually has their letters published. And finally, about a year ago, my publisher, HarperCollins, suggested that now was the time. So I went through approximately 500 existing letters and picked the best of the best. And they essentially tell her story in her own words from 1894, when she and her husband settled here in Missouri, until 1956, a few months before her death.
Who is she writing these letters to?
The letters are the full gamut: her family, her friends, her editor, her agent, her fans who wrote her by the buckets full of letters, and she answered each one of the fan letters. And the heart of the book, to me, is the correspondence between Wilder and her daughter, author Rose Wilder Lane. In the 30s and 40s, when those books were being produced, Rose Wilder Lane, who was a seasoned writer, a best-selling author, coached, aided, abetted, and essentially collaborated with Laura Ingalls Wilder in developing the Little House books. So that's very interesting insight into the craftsmanship and the writing of the books.
When you're reading these, it wasn't on a typewriter. They weren't emails. These were handwritten pens, quills?
She wrote on nickel school tablets, lined paper, and in pencil. So she did the drafts of the books. They still exist. These people saved every scrap of paper they wrote on, so they're a biographer's dream. And we have the manuscripts today. From there, they went to Rose Wilder Lane, who was often living in New York City with her own career going full steam. Rose would type them, and then they'd ship them back and forth, pen edit them.
Wow.
And finally, there was a clean final draft that went to Harper and Brothers publishers. And her editor at Harper often said, the Wilder books required no editing, not any, because they were in such good shape.
How does somebody who lives on the plains become so educated in the English language?
That family had a long tradition of storytelling. Her father, Pa Ingalls, was a great storyteller, evidently passed it on to Laura, and then certainly to Rose, who was a crack short story writer, novelist, journalist, world traveler in the 20s through 1960s when she went to Vietnam to report. So it was a family tradition.
The Selected Letters of Laura Ingalls Wilder. William Anderson, our guest. Bookstores everywhere, Amazon.com, you can find it. The books, the Little House books, how popular were they in the day?
They were published during the Depression, but they transcended the shortage of money, and they became staples in American libraries and school classes, heard them. And we can track this because Wilder saved all the fan mail that she got. And there are thousands of responses that she wrote to kids around America, and I included some of those wonderful letters she wrote back to her readers.
Willa Cather, similar to Laura Ingalls, influenced contemporaries? Where does that all fit in?
I think you right on with that, because Cather wrote about the Nebraska pioneers, and I taught Cather for a while, and I would think this is something that Rose Wilder Lane or Laura Ingalls Wilder might have said.
Right.
And they were in the general region. Wilder wrote of life from Wisconsin to Minnesota to Kansas to South Dakota, and then finally when they settled here in Missouri.
I don't know much about Laura Ingalls Wilder, but somebody made me, believe it or not, my old boss was the inspiration for Willa Cather in My Antonia. And so
Antonia Shimerda, right?
So, it was the grandson of My Antonia.
Okay.
Was my boss. And so
Pavelka.
That's right. Kent Pavelka, who was the voice of the Huskers for years. He was a broadcaster.
Interesting.
He was my boss, and one day he tells me this. And I'm like, wait a minute, you're the grandson of My Antonia? So he makes me, so I go home and I read the book. That was one of the best books I ever read. It was phenomenal, and it transformed you back to that day.
Absolutely.
On the prairie, trying to figure it all out.
The impact of Wilder and Cather, two different audiences, would be the same.
Yeah, really interesting. Wasn't there a fight recently about the royalties of this? Of Laura Ingalls Wilder and the books?
We're talking maybe 20 years ago, but the Wilders left no descendants. And the Little House Heritage Trust now administers the books, the book rights, the movie rights, the TV rights, and so on. And the local library in Mansfield, Missouri, felt that they deserved a share of the royalties because Mrs. Wilder left them ultimately to that library, which was named for her, and she was very partial to that library, of course. But it was settled finally.
Gotcha. You also said that in Mansfield, Missouri, there's a brand new reopened home there? Well,
Mansfield, Missouri is the epicenter of the Wilder sites.
Which is just outside of Springfield, we should say.
About an hour from Springfield, and all of the sites of the books have memorials, restored homes. And I'm on that board, and we really worked hard to raise funds for this new state-of-the-art museum building right on the complex close to their original home. It opened up last week when the museum opened for the season. And it's going to be formally dedicated April 22nd. So that's a real feat, and it's a good, safe place for all the artifacts of the family.
Yeah. It's amazing reading this stuff in the 21st century with cell phones and email and text and video conferencing to think about, they really bring you back to, the rains aren't coming, the crop's not going to grow, the roof flew off the house, I'm worried he keeps coughing, right? I mean, it's life and death struggle every day.
Life was hard, and that was a man versus nature struggle against the weather, the elements, and I particularly remember the book The Long Winter, where this family was essentially stranded for 5-6 months. The trains couldn't get through out to Dakota Territory, and the people had a real struggle to survive.
Yeah, and it also, you gained such great respect for these people who lived this life, who were right the outpost of America.
They were amazing, and men like Charles Ingalls, Laura's father, he knew how to cope with just about any frontier situation. The guy could hunt, trap, build a house, farm. He was just amazingly skilled and canny, and of course he was a great fiddler, and we've got Pa's original fiddle at the museum, and people weep when they go in there and see the fiddle.
I bet. Let's talk about the TV show, because the TV show, I guess Michael Landon took the rights and then did his own thing with it?
Actually, Ed Friendly, who produced Laugh-In
Okay.
and other famous movies, TV movies, and so on, he saw his children reading these books, and on a flight to New York City, he hid Little House on the Prairie in a Time magazine and read it. And when he got to New York, he said, "Who owns the rights to this book?" And that first was seen on television as a 2-hour pilot, a very good show.
Right, the movie.
Yes, and then it immediately was picked up for a series, ran from 74 to 83, phenomenally popular, but it deviated from the original books. We have several classes of Wilder people, those that only like the books, those that despise the television show,
Right.
and those that like both. But it certainly did make a higher profile for the Little House stories. And Dean Butler, who played Almanzo, has told me that more people today see that show worldwide than they did when it was prime time on NBC. It's all over the world.
Yeah,
like the books.
It's still on TV. I come across it once in a while.
Every day.
Yeah, yeah. And you also mentioned there's a movie coming out, or they're talking about a movie?
It's in the talking stage, and it will be a major motion picture of Little House on the Prairie, and the Friendly family are very enthused about making this happen.
The book is called The Selected Letters of Laura Ingalls Wilder. William Anderson is the editor of the letters and put them all together in a book. Let me ask you one more question before we go, because you mentioned the movie, the 2-hour movie, it was good. And I remember as a kid watching that movie and really liking it for all sorts of reasons. But in the movie, they build the house, and it's the heart. It was a Minnesota. Wasn't were they up in Minnesota?
Southeast Kansas, which was Osage Indian Territory Reservation.
And they build the cabin, and they survive the winter, and they start planting. And what happens?
Pa was essentially a squatter, and the Osage had been promised that part of Kansas. The settlers started drifting in. It's the same old story about the Native Americans being encroached upon. And until that was settled, people like the Ingalls family really didn't essentially belong there. Well, they returned to Wisconsin.
So after they got set up, they were told to leave, and they left.
They had to go home. They went home to Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And then this other stories pick up.
And then why did they settle on Mansfield, Missouri?
1894, Laura and Almanzo Wilder had undergone years of crop failures, like my Antonia, difficulties, and they, with their little 7-year-old daughter Rose, made the trek from South Dakota to Mansfield, Missouri, which was being touted as an area where you could have small farms and be successful. And there they stayed.
Mansfield, Missouri, an hour, I guess, west of Springfield.
East.
I'm sorry. Yeah, east. An hour east of Springfield. So it's just before you get to Springfield. Worth a trip to go see. Great history right here in the state. The Selected Letters of Laura Ingalls Wilder. William Anderson, you're always welcome here. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks very much.